Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks all for coming. My name is Paul Garner. I'm delighted to introduce Deborah Cohen. Deborah Cohen is, we always bring you the best speakers, don't we?
No pressure.
Is an award-winning doctor, academic journal editor, and investigative journalist. So she's originally from Liverpool. She's published in The Telegraph, Panorama, Newsnight, File on 4, Dispatches, Channel 4, and The One Show.
Hezzy Heights.
and works on evidence-based medicine, epidemiology, and journalism altogether. In 2017, she got the Health Watch Award for courageous journalism in the face of attack, and has worked on anticoagulants, macular degeneration with the Avastin, WHO, and the pandemic flu conspiracies, and was the journalist that brought you Hadiza Bawa-Garba's story about reflective practice being used in a court of law. So she worked quite closely with Cochrane and the evidence-based health movement on oseltamivir and infertility treatments. That was on featured on Panorama last year. And also our engagement with Deborah has been around the TB vaccine published in the BMJ. So with that introduction, please, we look forward to hearing from you.
Thanks, Paul. I can talk in the local lingo if you prepare me to, obviously, but I'll tone it down just for now, so other people from outside might be listening in. Right, so Paul, thank you for the introduction, Paul. So one thing that I'm going to focus on is something that we've loosely dubbed investigative epidemiology. So two stories I'm going to look at in more depth, and I won't tell you everything that goes on behind the scenes because a lot of it is pretty unseemly at times. That's all off the record once the microphone's switched off. But there's looking at two specific stories. Who's heard of that drug, Tamiflu? Oseltamivir. Do people know much about it? What do people kind of know about Tamiflu?
Cost a lot of money.
Cost a lot of money. In this country, it was about, I think it was stockpiled to the tune of about £500 million in the case of a pandemic. So this is really where, I guess for me on a personal level, my foray into investigative journalism took off. I'd edited bits, so stuff about MMR and, you know, the Wakefield paper and things like that. I'd been involved in that. I'd been involved in editing. And my background is I trained initially to be a doctor, and I intercalated, so took a year out and I studied journalism. And I don't know what's worse, working in the NHS or working as an investigative journalist at the moment. And I think the Bawa-Garba story has kind of taught me it's a bit of both. So anyway, this was the first time, because I'd been commissioning editor at the BMJ, and I'd been commissioning and editing other people's stories. Then in 2009, the Cochrane collaboration came to us, and they'd been asked, do you know what was happening in 2009? Do you remember the big kind of pandemic, swine flu pandemic? So they'd been asked to update this, a Cochrane review, a systematic review into the use of antivirals or neuraminidase inhibitors, which were zanamivir, which is Relenza, made by GSK, and Tamiflu, or oseltamivir, which is made by Roche. And they've been asked to update it. And a previous iteration of their systematic review, which was 2006, sorry, I'm not very good with these, journalists, PowerPoint and journalists are not normally the best of friends. So 2006, this was the previous iteration. And as you can see, that was one of the conclusions. You know, if you give Tamiflu, it helps prevent lower respiratory tract complications, so it helps prevent secondary complications of influenza. That's quite a big deal, really, isn't it, if you think about it in an influenza pandemic? And this is what Roche was saying about the drug in 2009. And I always find, as a journalist, it's always helpful to look at the investors' briefings that companies are telling their investors, and what they're, you know, and this is the message that they're giving out. And this is actually on the CNBC. So they're actually going further than that. They're saying that Tamiflu can reduce hospitalizations by more than 60%. Now, if you've got a pandemic, how good is that? You know, people are getting really, really sick and needing kind of hospital care, and you can reduce the hospitalisations by 60%. You'd want to stockpile Tamiflu, wouldn't you, if knowing that, and you're thinking, oh, how are we going to cope, how the health service is going to cope? So that's what they were saying, and it's why the WHO have been recommending this product to governments for a number of years. So that's what they were saying about it. This man here, Sir Liam Donaldson, who used to be the Chief Medical Officer, he believed it was going to work. You know, we stockpiled 500 million, and also he believed it was going to halve hospitalisations. So, okay, great. So here we have Cochrane, who are funded by the NIHR, the National Institute of Health Research, so they're getting public funds, and the Australian equivalent to update their systematic review. They thought it was going to reduce secondary complications, hadn't quite gone as far as the hospitalisations. So it's all these messages going around about what Tamiflu was going to do, the effectiveness of Tamiflu. So, where did all this information come from? Well, it came from this. And this was published in Archives of Internal Medicine, which is now JAMA Internal Medicine, by first author Lauren Kaiser and corresponding author Frederick Hayden. Okay. And you can see, you know, is this working properly, this light? Am I pressing the wrong button? Is it? I can't even see where it's... I'm probably blinding someone, aren't I? I won't point it at you, I'll point it at the screen. Oh, there we go. You can see there. You can see there it's the reduces lower respiratory tract infections, antibiotic use and hospitalisation in healthy and at-risk adults. That's why we stockpiled so much, because we thought it was going to help healthy people. And again, but here we go. This is, so in 2000, the FDA had penalised Roche for saying that it was going to reduce complications. So what's going on? How do we know what's going on? So all this information is coming at you. Cochrane saying it was going to reduce complications. Roche is saying it. The FDA is saying it doesn't. You've got Liam Donaldson saying it, in fact going further and saying it's going to reduce hospitalisations. You've got that form of review, that one. Who do you think funded that review? Roche, yeah, quite. And those other authors, where do you think they work from? Not Fred Hayden, not Lauren Kaiser, where do you think they come from? Roche, okay. So that is very much the message that is being carried. So there we go, but actually the FDA are punishing Roche for actually saying this. So here we go. Tamiflu has not been shown to prevent complications. And that's on Tamiflu.com is the US website. So they're not allowed to say this in America. Here we go. You know, CDC, but the CDC are saying it. So there's all this kind of noise around the information. And obviously, if you're spending that kind of money, you want to know what you're really buying, don't you? So anyway, so who knows about how Cochrane works? So Cochrane have to respond to comments. Correct me if I'm wrong, Paul. They have to respond to comments. And so what we had is this Japanese paediatrician, Keishi Hayashi, who had pointed out that there was a problem with the Cochrane review. So they included this previous Kaiser, you know, this Kaiser review that we saw, this Roche-funded review article, included 10 manufacturer-funded RCTs from the late 90s. 2 out of 10 were published. 8 out of 10 were never published. Now, this is before you had clinicaltrials.gov where you had to register your trials. So that's what, so it's coming from this information that no one's really had sight of. So the Cochrane collaboration came to the BMJ, came to Channel 4 News, and this was the first time, so academic journal, Channel 4 News, mainstream media, and academics all working together to get to the bottom of all this mixed messaging. Now, what we want to do, so the first story I did was tracking down the data. We wanted to get that data. And again, more confusion. So again, with this kind of reducing kind of the secondary complications, you had those organisations, HHS in the US, CDC, you know, CDC are EMA, European Medicines Agency, Australian Therapeutic Goods Administration, the Australian regulators, Roche.com, the global website, and Cochrane are saying it does this, and then FDA, the Japanese authorities, Tamiflu.com, and Cochrane 2009. So eventually they realised perhaps this wasn't the case, because it's an unproven claim. So, anyway, so it's my job as the journalist, as the kind of dirty spade person digging in, trying to get to the bottom of things, doing the heavy lifting, to find out whether we could get the data. So first thing we did, the obvious thing to do, go to the lead and corresponding authors of the Roche-funded review. Can we have your data, please? So, email from Laurent Kaiser. I suggest you contact Roche directly. Now, who's lead author? Now, who knows about kind of authorship criteria on medical journals? You sign up to a list of criteria, the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors, to kind of say that you have oversight of the data, you have access to the data as lead author. You're taking primary responsibility for what is presented. But we went to and okay, that paper might have been done before the updated guidelines of the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors that spell out exactly the different roles on a paper. But that's what he was saying. This is the lead author who's supposed to have responsibility. Go to Roche. So we thought, okay, we'll go to Fred Hayden, who's the other independent expert paid for by Roche. Independent expert, though. Can't find his original files. He's moved offices. 2 years, he was 2 years at Geneva, in Geneva at WHO. Discarded. It's a bit dog at my homework as an excuse, to be perfectly honest. Don't know where they've gone. Oh, you'll have to go to Roche. Okay, we'll hold off a minute. So then we went to the lead authors. We thought, okay, there are 2 published RCTs, so we'll go to these guys. So John Trenner, Carl Nicholson, who's in JAMA, this was in the Lancet. So how did you get your data? Can we have your data? You know, this is a publicly funded update of a Cochrane systematic review. Can we have your data? And he said, oh, you know, I didn't perform the primary, didn't perform independent analysis. It was Roche that did it. And Carl Nicholson said he didn't recall seeing the primary data. So what's the point of those publications in journals if no one's actually seen the data? Is it marketing or is it science? Big question mark. Let you decide. I'm not going to put any thoughts in your mind. Anyway, so Roche has basically done the analysis. Now, this is where my job gets interesting. I deal with whistleblowers, and they come in all different varieties. And this one worked for Walters Kluwer Health and Addis International, and that's a comms company. It's actually based, I think it's based in Cheshire Way. And anyway, I was contacted by this whistleblower, and you spend so much time, when you're an investigative journalist, you spend so much time speaking to people off the record. You know, for every person you quote, I don't know how many you speak to off the record, dozens quite often. So I managed to kind of find, or she'd found me, and she had a copy of her contract with Addis International, and also a heap of marketing material for Roche, which then took me on to a second story later on. So that's what she had to do. She had to ghostwrite the papers, edit original articles and editorials and letters, including about oseltamivir. There are other drugs that Roche made as well that were included that I haven't included on here, including antiretrovirals and stuff. I think antipsychotics was another one in the arena that she was working in. So also she had to do abstracts, posters, slides for conferences. You know, and she basically ghostwrote the papers that you appeared in the journal. But also what they do is they insert keywords. So when you're doing marketing strategy, you want a certain message to come across. And that message was, guess what, folks? Reduces secondary complications and hospitalizations. So if you look across the papers, if you put the academic papers next to the marketing material, you'll see keywords across them. And that was, so it turns out that not only for those key publications that were informing policy globally in terms of stockpiling, not only had the lead authors never actually seen the primary data, they were ghost written, and actually content of them contained key marketing phrases that would make policy makers sit up and think and listen. So in the end, we absolutely failed in getting the clinical trial data. But what Roche did in the 11th hour, which this is where it's quite helpful working on a journal because you have access to all sorts of epidemiologists and statisticians. They said, guys, you can't have our clinical trial data, but we've got a lot of this great observational data that tells you it reduces secondary complications and hospitalizations. So I contacted an epidemiologist called Nick Fremantle and said, Nick, can you analyse that for us? And that ultimately made the story. And Nick said, nah, there's no way that Tamiflu does what Roche is saying based on these observational data. It just doesn't stack up. So what happened, Cochrane then published a review saying they can't verify it, they can't verify the claims, but Roche had promised to make full study reports available on a password-protected site. But actually that password-protected site only contained study summaries. It didn't contain the full documents. So that was the first part. And what often happens with investigations is you don't get what you want, or you don't, and ultimately it was access to clinical trial data. Has everyone heard of the All Trials campaign, which is about access to clinical trial data? All clinical trials should be registered and the data available. This kind of was one of the harbingers of that. It was helped kickstart the All Trials campaign. So then, do you remember me mentioning the marketing materials that I had been given by the whistleblower? When I was reading through them, I thought, oh, this is interesting. These are advisors to governments. These are advisors to WHO. These are key policy advisors and experts that we're relying on to devise our policy around the pandemic and around what we should do with antivirals in terms of stockpiling. So what you learn quite quickly is, what do you think annoys people more? If you mention, we can't get access to trial data, we might have spent $500 million on drugs just in one country alone, or that guy over there has got a conflict of interest. What do you think causes more ire, more consternation? It's pointing out the conflict of interest. So what I've kind of learned to do is, if you almost have, and everyone's got conflict of interest. Everyone's got academic conflicts of interest, different financial conflicts of interest. I mean, and obviously there are different levels. But if you mix a conflict of interest story with a story about kind of evidence and data and science, the story about the data and evidence of science gets overlooked because people are so enraged that you've pointed out they might have a conflict of interest. So you kind of learn to separate them out. Show the science, or lack thereof, or the bad science first, and then maybe talk about the conflicts of interest later. At least allow people to digest what you're saying about the data before you kind of go and the red flag about the conflicts of interest. So anyway, so we then started to dig. This was with the Bureau of Investigative Journalism and Al Jazeera, this next story. We then started to dig into where these advisors have been. So it's almost like a mini social kind of network analysis, if you like. And what we'd found is the scientists had been paid to market Tamiflu, and this was before Tamiflu had even got onto the market. So what happens is you create hype around a drug. This is before it even had a name. You know, it was just a kind of code word. It wasn't even oseltamivir at this point. It was a funny number and letters. They'd been marketing it since then. And so Roche's whole marketing plan, and again, digging, was to enlist third-party partners to serve as spokespeople, increase awareness of Tamiflu and its benefits. So that was its end goal. Now, medical societies. Where do you think ESWI, which is the European Scientific Working Group on Influenza, where do you think they got their money from? I haven't, obviously, pointing those. I'm aware of libel and juxtaposition of kind of pictures, by the way, then you can defame people that way. I won't give examples because it'll be defamatory, but there we go. You know, Roche was one of the main funders of ESWI, along with other drug companies. And they actually had a policy plan in 2006 to 2010. So already in 2005, you had the bird flu kind of being talked about, and there were concerns about bird flu. But their next policy plan was to lobby politicians to develop a policy for antiviral stockpiling. So you've got the same people who were on those trials in the publications, who probably hadn't seen the data, who hadn't seen the data because we asked them about it, who are then marketing for Roche and also on a European Scientific Working Group for influenza who were lobbying politicians and who were the policy advisors. Does that sound like a great arena to be making policy? Generally, who thinks that's a good idea? Just take a straw poll. Do you want the people marketing a drug to be developing the policy about how to use the drug? Does anyone think that's a good idea? Yeah, no. But it was amazingly controversial pointing this out, I can assure you. And also, as we kind of said, it needed to know, the governments needed to know that antivirals are beneficial and safe. Have we got much evidence that they're beneficial? And what about the safety? Who knows? We'll come on to that in a minute. So, and WHO was struggling. They were struggling to go. They were using these same people as well. And actually, one of their main reports that predated the 2005 bird flu pandemic was written by Fred Hayden. Fred Hayden, who had been on the Roche-funded review, who hadn't seen the data, whose dog ate his homework. And he'd written for this, and he was upfront about it when we asked him. He was a paid consultant for Roche at the time of writing these guidelines for WHO. And the guidelines, they concluded that you should have plans for developing the availability of antivirals, and you need to stockpile. So we asked WHO about declarations of interest. We never got them. And the whole point of declarations of interest is, if challenged, and I've been challenged on mine before, I did a story about sports drinks, 2012, prior to the Olympics. When that went out, I was challenged on my conflicts of interest and asked to produce. And I was like, I kind of work for the BMJ. Not sure what my conflicts would be on this. Okay, I'm an investigative journalist. I do what it says on the tin. I dig, I expose. But in terms of my financial interests in sports drinks, I haven't exactly got many. I support Liverpool Football Club, and I think they've got a relationship with Gatorade, but that's about as far as it goes. So, and they've never been publicly disclosed. It's not great, really, is it? If you've got a consultant that's writing a report for you, you'd kind of want to have it on the bottom that they were consulting for Roche. You'd think, wouldn't you? Is that controversial? Is anything I've said up to now really, really controversial that makes you go, no, it's not. No, you're talking nonsense. Honestly do say, because there's a reason I ask. So then, anyway, so this story went out. It went nuclear. I was investigated by Nature. Nature did a takedown of the story. And the whole point was we've got drugs that we cannot verify the scientific evidence for, that WHO are recommending, have been stockpiled around the world globally, in the UK alone to the tune of £500 million, that the UK alone. There were even talks about fights between countries about who was going to get the stockpile of the drug. And we were talking to kind of people in Italy, and Roche was saying to them, you better stockpile because the UK is taking it all at the moment and we don't have many drugs left, so you want to get stockpiling. So there were actually fights about, and I believe, and I haven't corroborated this, but I think I think it might have been Senegal and somewhere else, there was actually a fight over who was going to get the kind of stockpile of Tamiflu when we're all struck down by pandemic flu. So, it's kind of important that around transparency and you have access to data and these things are declared. By Nature, I was investigating. There's a couple of journalists, now I was saying before, that I don't want to speak ill of my own, but I will, that they're real kind of hypers. The slightest, vaguest sense of you don't talk about malaria or diarrheal disease. There's vaguest sense that there are a few chickens dying of pandemic, some kind of influenza in China. It's all over Twitter. All over Twitter. And, that might be fair enough. But if you do the kind of count, and I think it was Hans Rosling that might have done one, count of stories and media attention to certain infections, some get a lot of hype, and influenza is definitely one of them. And there is an interest, isn't there? If you want research funding, etc., etc. I'm not saying that any of these people have done it, but if you think about it, there is a real interest to keep that high on the agenda because people are going to fund you. And that is helped by media that we're all going to die of influenza. And it might be true. I'm not saying that there aren't severe cases of influenza at all. But in terms of actually what gets attention, influenza gets a lot of attention. And like I say, we had takedowns galore and And one main one was from a journal, Declan Butler from Nature, and then Nature were tweeting that the story had been discredited. But yet WHO then asked Harvey Feinberg, who's the Institute of Medicine in the US, to undertake a review on how they handle conflicts of interest. So that was the first kind of step into, whoa, sit your heads above the parapet. I knew it was controversial, I didn't quite realise how controversial. You're like, okay. But then the other aspect that came up in these stories was how drugs are approved. Now, does anyone kind of know the basics of how the European Medicines Agency compared to the Food and Drugs Administration look at data that has been submitted to them about a drug approval? So they have two slightly different approaches. So what the FDA does is they will actively look at the primary data themselves and try to recreate these statistical analyses on the data themselves. So they will go right through to the kind of, I think as far as down to the patient records and see whether what the company's saying is submitted as their drug approval is true, whether they can recreate the statistics. What the European Medicines Agency does is they rely on the company's summaries of the data and will ask for more data or ask further questions if they see fit. So there's two different approaches. Some would say the FDA's is probably more rigorous, but that doesn't mean that they listen to their statistical reviewers or their clinical reviewers that are drilling down on the data. So before oseltamivir, Tamiflu came onto the market, zanamivir was the first one. I spoke to Michael Elishoff, who was a former FDA statistician. He left after this. So when he did the analysis on zanamivir, he found that it was no more effective than placebo when patients were on other drugs such as paracetamol. So effectively, it was controlling symptoms. What was it actually doing to the virus itself? So in other words, if you were taking concomitant medication, it was masking the symptoms of influenza, so it made the zanamivir not look as effective. And so the advisory committee, so the FDA have an advisory committee that decide to take a vote on drugs. They decided to turn it down. But higher up overturned that recommendation because they just wanted something on the market in case of a pandemic. And his view, Elishoff's view, was it was a scientific decision, it was a political decision, not a scientific decision. And he was actually meant to be doing the oseltamivir, the Tamiflu review after the Valenza-zanamivir review, and he was taken off it. And he left the FDA after that point because he felt this is politics, not science. So it's all these other stories and narratives. When you're investigating, there's all these other things that come up. And if you think about it, what I was saying about systematic review, all this information and these whistleblowers and stories have come out because Cochrane were looking at the data or trying to get data in a systematic way. So what we were doing is Cochrane was sticking to the evidence, sticking to the data, and journalists alongside them were investigating the things that the data were throwing up. Ask questions. Why is that person saying this, as I went back to before? So what you do is you're thinking, why have we got into this situation where Cillian Donaldson is saying this is going to reduce hospitalizations? Why are we stockpiling this drug? So all along you're asking those questions alongside academics or independent academics that are looking at the data. So they can work quite well in tandem. And it's a method that we've kind of been developing. And I'll come on to the MVA story in a minute. But, you know, this is just one way at really interrogating why health and science policy is as it is and what the data are saying. So then, you know, I mentioned EMA, and they'd used also conflicted experts. So EMA have experts that give them evidence and talk to them about the drug, and their experts were conflicted. They were in marketing material. And then again, they were saying about, and again, I think EMA came to a similar conclusion that they weren't sure about the benefits in terms of secondary complications or impact on secondary complications, but they had presentations from experts. And EMA was never able to produce any conflict of interest statements. And actually after it, EMA then clamped down on how they do conflicts of interest. So I think the other thing about if you do rigorous investigative journalism along with rigorous science, the impact it can have. I mean, there was public accounts committee inquiries into the stockpiling of Tamiflu. The European Parliament took a look at it, the Council of Europe. There were letters to the Senate and the FDA, Senate to investigate it. So you can have quite good impact if you combine kind of rigorous journalism with rigorous data analysis. And then, you know, the Open Data campaign, and there was a big campaign to get the European Medicines Agency. So when you apply for a new drug, you produce, as a company, you produce what's called a clinical study report. Now, these are tens of thousands of pages, I think, huge dossiers of information. And if you think about it, how do you, now I'm an editor, I edit stuff. How do you turn those 10,000 pages of information into 8 pages you see in a medical journal? You might miss out the odd bit of data here and there, mightn't you, know, because that's what the editor says. Or you might stick it in a supplementary appendix that people don't really look at. So there's a real kind of push, you know, thank kind of Peter Doshi and Tom Jefferson for this. There's a real push to get access to these clinical study reports because there was a sense that it contained much more information that we, as doctors and academics, are able to see in a medical journal. So in other words, I'm saying don't believe medical journals. I am an editor at the BMJ still, but don't believe us. And query everything I've written here, by the way, it's fine. So eventually, after a lot of pushing, so EMA then said, yeah, we're going to release clinical study reports. They were then challenged at the European Court of Justice, and the European Court of Justice have just ruled in favour of the European Medicines Agency, only, I think, about a week ago, saying that, you know, they can release, this is data that we should have access to. Clinical trial data is publicly accessible information, and in fact, it is subject to freedom of information laws. So you can get, unlike medical devices, and I'm not touching on today, but that's a whole different ball game. So it turns out that there wasn't just those 10 trials and then the odd prophylaxis trial or post-prophylaxis trial that existed. There was actually 74 Roche trials. Who knew? You might know a bit more now with clinicaltrials.gov. But this shows the importance of transparency, doesn't it? That we need to know what trials are actually being done. Don't necessarily know that with animal research, but we'll come on to. So in terms of clinical research, strides are being taken, slow ones, but then obviously we won't go into how you can gain clinical trials to get the outcomes you need, etc., etc. There's the whole of the ball game. But slow progress. And it took lots and lots of stories to get to this point, almost campaigning. And Tamiflu kind of became, in many ways, the kind of poster child of this campaign to access clinical trial information. And so then when Cochrane eventually got them, they concluded that it doesn't even stop. And the FDA had never allowed this claim, but we had it in Europe. And if you think about how different ways the data analysis and the access to data that EMA had, or the ways of processing data EMA had compared to the FDA, the FDA had never allowed that one, that transmission. I'm really not very good with this, am I? So they'd never allowed the transmission statement or the secondary complications. And it also found harms that weren't in the published literature. And some of those were kind of neuropsychiatric harms. And what they found when they really drilled down in the data was inconsistency in coding and how you analyse harms. So you know what I was talking about in terms of gaming outcomes and how you can get the outcomes you want. And one of the trials alone, I think, had 10 serious adverse events that were in the data that in the clinical study reports that weren't in the published literature. So at that point, this particular group of the Cochrane collaboration were like, we can't rely on the published literature anymore. So it took, from 2009 to 2014, stories and digging and highlighting the issues to get to that point where we had independent academics who were able to fully get a sense of what had actually gone on in the clinical trials. And there were lots of other things that they found in terms of what was actually in the placebo and everything else, but it shows you, you're going from a position of almost absolute absence of transparency in terms of conflicts of interest, in terms of access to data, to this is what's happened, we stockpiled this drug, cost a fortune, potentially got lots of harms, and actually the HPA's, the Health Protection Agency's own study, found when they gave it to a group of kids in southeast London that half had side effects from the drug. Now, what does that mean in terms of compliance, particularly if you're using it prophylactically? If it's going to make you vomit and have diarrhea and, you know, headaches and any potential neuropsychiatric effects, what's compliance going to look like? So what does that mean in terms of an intervention for stopping spread? If you're otherwise well, why would you take something that's going to make you feel? 50% of people feel pretty ropey. And how useful is that then as an intervention? So it's all these other questions that it throws up after you've got access to these data. So that was the first story. Any questions? I haven't depressed you all, have I? My world's a pretty depressing place. So then, who's heard of this story? You might, work closely with Paul amongst other people. So this is another example of the use of systematic review working alongside investigative journalism. And as I say, we've been calling it investigative epidemiology. So you can understand why there is a big need to have a better vaccine for TB. Obviously better treatment, also better vaccine. Kills over 1 million people each year. I think that's probably a conservative estimate. And the effectiveness of BCG varies around the world. So Oxford University, you can imagine there's a clamour on, a lot of money kind of from public funds to develop a new booster vaccine or new vaccine for TB. And it's going to win a Nobel Prize. If someone finds it, it likely will win a Nobel Prize. Something that would have that magnitude of effect on health is a potential contender. So Oxford University were developing what they call MVA85A, and it's an experimental booster to be given along BCG. So you have your BCG, you have MVA. And when a trial of it in South African infants was published in 2009, it failed to show it was effective. So this is where I'm coming at in the story. Okay, so this is my entry point in kind of story. These 2 points. And like we were saying before, the entry point into the story were all these weird and wonderful claims about Tamiflu and Cochrane trying to access the data and try and perform a systematic review. So there are different when you're a journalist, there are different entry points. Occasionally you do get a brown envelope, and I've had 2 of them in the past couple of weeks actually. Anonymous brown envelopes, you open up, you're like, oh, what's inside? There's no signature. You look at the stamp where it's been sent from, try and work out where it's come from. And that does happen, and that's happened to me twice, like I say, only in the past couple of weeks. But there's other ways. Sometimes things just don't smell right, or they just don't seem right. So again, this failed to show it was effective. Done in almost 2,000 children, infants in South Africa. Then there's a systematic review done here. Paul was one of the authors on it. It's an independent one, and they're looking at the preclinical data, mice, guinea pigs, cattle and monkeys. And the data didn't find any evidence to support the efficacy of MVA85A as a BCG booster. And it also raised various concerns about the kind of quality of the animal studies that were done. How do you get to that point? In the pathway of research, you start off doing lab and animal stuff, the preclinical, then you move phase 1, which is predominantly safety, phase 2, safety, efficacy, then phase 3, your big kind of efficacy, effectiveness trials. So why have we got, when this is saying there's no evidence to support efficacy in the animal stuff, then we've got a big phase 2 trial that's showing that there's a lack of efficacy. Is that surprising? We've got no efficacy in animals and then no efficacy in humans. How did we get from no efficacy in animals to big trials? What went on there? And even publishing, and this is Shah Ibrahim, who was the editor of the IJE, International Journal of Epidemiology. Spoke to him, and publishing that systematic review was challenging. It wasn't easy. People complained. Publishing negative animal data. And people literally, and he's on the record with this, so I'm not kind of breaching, off-the-record sources. If you publish this, a lot of people are going to be very unhappy with you. Phone call for it to be rejected. Publishing will push negative findings underground. I mean, what kind of an argument is that? Don't publish any criticism of animal research because no one's going to publish their negative findings. Is that scientific? Who thinks that's a good idea? Oh, if we get criticised or raise concerns, we're not going to publish anything. And also, there's that. Unfair to pick on the MVA group of researchers. Many other groups do not publish negative preclinical efficacy data. Is that a good reason not to publish something? You publish that. No, yeah?
There's a huge amount of preclinical data that isn't published because there's just a huge amount of preclinical data that goes into the development of something. So to say that not publishing negative preclinical data is kind of, to a certain extent, understandable. If you're doing translational research at that very beginning point, you do huge amounts of stuff, you do huge amounts of experiments that will never see the light of day just because.
Why? That's the question.
Because they're exploratory.
But is that good science? Are you going to replicate, then therefore, if you don't publish negative findings in exploratory research, isn't that scientific waste?
That's relevant science, though. Like that is science all over. People do not publish data that they don't find.
But what does that mean in terms of ethics? What does that mean in terms of ethics? What does that mean in terms of waste? If you're not publishing negative stuff, somebody down the road might repeat the same mistakes further down the line. Then you've got unethical experiment, potentially unethical experimentation on animals. You don't want to experiment on animals if you can help it. You have to think, these are creatures that you're experimenting on. And this is not an anti-vivisectionist argument. It's simply, why would you want to repeat the mistakes or repeat studies that have already been done on animals that you're going to have to euthanize? Oh, I've only got 10 minutes. I'm going to have to rattle through this. I can talk, can't I? I am from Liverpool. So, we can have all this debate. And, it's a debate to have, but I'll rattle through it. So then they came across this study, and it's in 2010, and it was an aerosol challenge of tuberculosis in rhesus macaques, allegedly, apparently. That was 2010, that study was published. Now, when was that trial, that South African baby trial published? It was 2009, and I realise this is quite a complex story. So you'd already had a trial in almost 2,000 babies done, and then this was published. Okay, and what did this show? So this was a study that was this was the publication of a study that was conducted in 2006, and it probably helps answer some of the questions that we've just raised here. Started in 2006. 16 macaques, there they are, not literally the ones that took part in the study, I hasten to add. Well, I don't know, I don't think they were. And they were given BCG alone, BCG plus MVA, or neither, and then they're exposed to TB. And it finished in 2007, 18 months before the start of the efficacy trial in South Africa, and 3 months before of a safety trial in babies. And it was published in 2010. Now let's see, here's the Kaplan-Meier statistic, or graph. Now, the blue one is BCG. BCG look to be doing all right in that, don't they? But look at the white blobs. Look what's happening to those monkeys. And look at one that's happening to no vaccine. So look at the green and white blobs. What's that showing you? They're not doing very well, are they, those monkeys that have had BCG plus MVA85A, compared to the BCG vaccine? And if you look at them, those that have had, it looks like similar-ish to those that have had no vaccine. Now, if you were getting that from monkeys before you went into babies, what would you think? Would you want to quickly go into babies, or would you want to stop and think? So you've got 5 out of 6 of the monkeys that have received BCG plus MVA who are having to be euthanized early. Would you want to go and test in babies straight away? It might raise a few alarm bells. So basically, we had that information. So this is how we investigated what actually went on. We did a series of FOIs for investigators. So what you've got is not only a lack of evidence of efficacy in small animal studies, you've got monkeys who are dying off fairly quickly or having to be euthanized at a similar-ish kind of rate. It's not statistically significant, I hasten to add, as those that have received no vaccine at all. So it's a potential safety alert, isn't it? It's like, what's going on here? Whoa, could, given that we are more like monkeys than we are like mice, I think most of us here are, I would hasten to say you might want to, it might really ring a few alarm bells and you might want to ask a few questions. So we had investigator brochures are the dossiers that you give to people, to ethics committees, to regulators, to people that are doing trials that sum up the information that you've got on that particular intervention. So it's kind of the lay of the land. So we've got the investigators brochures, grant submissions, because obviously a lot of this was publicly funded. Welcome, Gates as well. European Clinical, Developing Country Clinical Trials Partnership, the MRC, a lot of money had gone into this. So protocols, etc., etc. So all the kind of bits and pieces that would go into a clinical trial taking part. Then also got leaked documents and letters which were necessary. This is Oxford University we're talking about here, Public Health England, and Porton Down is where they do their animal experiments. And it was weeks and weeks of asking questions, dozens of on-the-record and off-the-record comments. So this is what we found through FOI. So this is from Oxford University to the first one of the participants. So this is to trial participants. MVA has been tested in animals and is shown to be safe and effective in animals. Has it? From what I've just told you about the systematic review that showed a lack of evidence of efficacy in the monkey study, is that fair to tell the parents of babies that are going to be enrolled in a clinical trial that the MVA was shown to be safe and effective? Do you think that's a fair assessment of the evidence? No. Okay, so investigators' brochures. So this is what goes to ethics committees, it goes to the investigators, it goes to regulators to get the sign-off for the clinical trial. Protective efficacy studies using MVA boost strategy, as followed by challenge, have been conducted in 4 animal species. And again, evidence of protection. Is that what the evidence suggested? So do you think the right information has been given to the regulators and given to parents? Then, now, this was the contract research agreement. So do you remember that aerosol challenge? So Oxford was saying after the study had been done, you've seen the Kaplan-Meier curve, that actually it was a study to evaluate the protective efficacy. So on the one hand, on the published literature, they're saying it's to test a new model to test MVA, but actually the contract research agreement they have with the Porton Down is to evaluate protective efficacy, and also show promising results in small animal models of vaccination. Now, the systematic review had looked at mice and guinea pigs. It wasn't showing protective efficacy. So that was from there. And then the grant application form, shown to be protective against TB in 4 animal models, including non-human primates. But that Kaplan-Meier curve looked like it was protecting monkeys that I showed you. And there was one other macaque study that was done, and equally it didn't show protective efficacy. So it's a way of investigating. The systematic review is flagging up a lack of efficacy. We know a clinical trial's gone ahead. That wasn't how the animal data was being presented to parents, to the collaborators, to the funders, to regulators and to ethics committees. And then we didn't get some information. Sorry, that should say March 2008. That's my fault. So when we were applying under FOI, we didn't get some information we asked for, which was, some of it was reasoned, some of it just didn't appear, but we got a leak. So March 2008 was the document that Oxford University gave to get ethical approval for the clinical trial in South African infants. They didn't send it to us. The monkey study had finished by then. It finished in November 2007. Oxford didn't give it to us. We got it elsewhere. Were those monkey data in that brochure that was going to get ethical approval? No. So there was no mention, when they were getting ethical approval, there was no mention of that monkey study that we saw, the Kaplan-Meier curve. Okay. We were unable to get a protocol. Should you be able to get a protocol for research, that particularly, publicly funded research, or a protocol generally? Should that be accessible? How did we, so Oxford was saying publicly it was only to test a new model. But we had suspicions it was about efficacy. We've seen the contract research agreement. But we were refused access to the protocol because of safety to staff. The research was published. We was refused the ethics application. Then, when we asked the ethics committee in South Africa and the regulators why they gave ethical approval for this to be tested in babies, they said, oh, Oxford gave it to us in a supplementary appendix. We asked for the supplementary appendix. Did we get it? No. In fact, Oxford said it didn't exist. Two different stories. And then we asked for the 3 investigations. So Oxford University carried out 3 investigations into these academics, exonerated every time. We asked for them, we didn't get them. But we got leaked letters. So, I mean, this is not, and I'll kind of round up now, this is not a one-off example. And what we were told repeatedly is, you know, this is just one example of systematic failure in afflicting preclinical research. So you can't get access to protocols. They aren't pre-registered. You don't know what animal research is going on. Like you're saying, thousands of animal studies might be going on. We don't even know whether they're going on or where they're going on. And as we've seen with Tamiflu, how important that transparency is. If we're going to kind of evaluate an evidence base, we're really going to know what's going on, how we're going to invest our money in terms of research. There's a push for systematic reviews of animal data before funding. I think the NIH in the States, as Paul mentioned before, is one of them. They're asking for these data. But if the data aren't there, we don't know they exist. How valid are those systematic reviews? It's kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy. So, you know, there seems to be a lack of understanding of statistical methods, the lack of pre-specification of the purpose of animal studies. So one of the concerns with that monkey study is, and what we know is there were conversations going on, and this is corroborated, about the fact that these monkeys were really sick and ailing. There was real concern about the MVA monkeys. But it looks like what's happened is there's been post hoc decision about what that study was about. And that's the point of a protocol. It sets out everything a priori, so we know what's going to take place. So you can then verify methods and statistics and everything else. And then, you know, we're told this is commonplace, as you were saying, selective reporting of results driven by pressure to obtain funding and ethics approval. You know, it's a failure of regulators. Regulators kind of know animal data exists, but they don't. The MHRA actually said to us, oh, we're more interested in safety than we are of efficacy. Well, okay, you've got your safety study. If you're doing efficacy studies, surely that's an important part of the jigsaw. Otherwise, why do them? Is it ethical to do them if you're not going to use the results of them? And, you know, that's what we were told, is failure to actually pay any attention to this aspect of research. And then, you know, there's the inaccessibility of supporting evidence and protocols. And then there's a poorly managed financial and academic conflicts of interest. So the Oxford group had a financial stake in MVA. So they'd done the early development work, they'd been involved in the preclinical testing, and they were involved in the clinical testing. How objective, in the greatest will in the world, can you be in the benefits and harms of your baby? If you've developed this, it's close to your heart, how objective can you be? And that mightn't be they saw like pound signs in the distance, oh, we're going to make a fortune out of this. But in terms of objectivity and bias. So those are all the questions it kind of raised. And the impact, you kind of think, might go, small fry, really, grand scheme of things, no one died. We don't know what happened to there's no evidence of harm that's come to those babies. But they're only followed up for a certain period of time, but I hasten to add there's no evidence of harm. But, you know, the whistleblower who raised concerns, because we spoke a lot to someone called Peter Beverley, and he was raising concerns. He was instrumental in the investigations. He was booted out of Oxford. He had to work elsewhere, was unable to carry out his research. The funding given on the basis of misrepresented data means it's an opportunity cost to that. It means that someone else isn't getting getting that money to develop something that might actually have a chance of working. The scientific community were led to believe that the trial results were a surprise, that the animal data had shown effectiveness. So when the trial results came out and it wasn't effective, it was like, oh, well, what's gone on here? And actually, ARIS, which is part of, you know, Gates is a heavy funder of this, as well as DFID. They pulled back funding from human trials because they thought animal models had failed to be predictive. But they hadn't they? If you look at what they were saying compared to what the trial had said, but there was a belief, because of misrepresentation of what the animal data showed, that this is failing, therefore we need to refocus our research and funding. So then you've got distorted funding. So actually the impact of what mightn't seem massive in the long term and in words of someone we spoke to, has actually set the TB arena back, because we're now questioning the basic premise of what we believe to be true. We're now questioning, we don't know whether it's true or not. Can we rely on these animal models that we've been used to study and evaluate interventions for TB? So that's the impact that distortion can have. So I'll kind of round it up there, but these are just two examples of how investigative journalists can work alongside academics to really understand what's going on and shine a spotlight on things actually that people don't want you to have a spotlight shone on.